The hot sun burned the asphalt, filling the streets with the thick scent of heated air and blooming acacia trees. Amara arranged plastic cups on a makeshift table made from an old crate. Her little lemonade stand looked almost a symbol of childlike innocence. A hand-drawn poster that read, "Homemade lemonade is $1, a few bottles of the bright yellow drink, and the endless hope for success in her eyes." "We're sure to get a lot today, Mom," Amara said confidently, turning to see her mother standing on the doorstep. She smiled and nodded approvingly, but something in her gaze was troubling. The first customers approached with interest. A young couple with a little girl stopped at the stand. Amara, radiant, handed the child a glass of lemonade, her light laughter ringing like a bell. People left with smiles, and the change jingled in the glass jar, creating a melody of hope. But the shadow around the corner had already frozen. Policeman Gerard Slocum watched the scene, leaning against the door of the patrol car. His gaze was hard, cold. Amara didn't see him, completely immersed in her small business. But to Gerard, this scene was a challenge. He adjusted his belt, where the handcuffs and baton hung, and clutched the walkie-talkie in his hand. His mind was spinning. Illegal trade. There they go again, as usual. Amara had no way of knowing that behind her every smile and honest labor at that moment, a threat was beginning to form. "Is something wrong, honey?" The older woman who had stopped to buy a glass asked quietly. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Pearson," Amara replied, not noticing the woman's gaze sliding over her shoulder to the approaching officer. Gerard's shadow began to fall on the lemonade stand. At that moment, the sun seemed to stop warming. Gerard Slocum walked slowly, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a distinctive thud. Each step seemed to echo down the empty street. His figure was the epitome of discipline and fear. Tall, angular, in a perfectly pressed uniform, his badge gleaming on his lapel. Amara looked up upon hearing the sound, her smile fading slightly. She noticed the officer, but tried not to show fear. Her mother had always said, "Keep your head high, no matter what anyone says or does." Well, what do we have here? Gerard stopped at the booth, leaning in so close that Amara could smell his cologne mixed with sweat. "This is my lemonade stand, sir," she replied politely, trying to keep her composure. Her voice shook slightly, but she continued. "I want to save up money for a school trip." "On a school trip, you say?" His voice sounded sarcastic, each word freezing in the air. "And you think you can just go out on the street and start selling?" Amara blinked, trying to figure out what he meant. "But I just sell lemonade. People love it." "It's called trafficking, girl," he interrupted sharply, not letting her finish. "Do you know you need a permit for that? Do you even realize you're breaking the law?" Amara felt her heart beat faster. The crowd that had earlier smiled and cheered her initiative began to back away, wary of messing with the officer. Even the elderly Mrs. Pearson, who had just praised the lemonade, took a step back, lowering her gaze. I didn't know, sir." "I'm sorry," she mumbled, feeling the fear start to creep up her throat. "You didn't?" He smirked, his face contorted in a hard, almost animalistic grimace. "That's why people like you break the law all the time. You think you can do anything." Those words, "people like you," stabbed her. Amara froze, her hands trembling, but she pulled herself together. "That's not true, sir. I just want to earn an honest living to help my mom." Gerard straightened up, giving her a look full of contempt. "You want an honest job? Then get a real job, and I want this booth taken down. Now, But it's just lemonade. Remove, he bellowed so loudly that she flinched. Silence enveloped the street. Gerard pulled out a notebook and wrote something down, then looked at her as if he expected her to rush to do his bidding. The crowd looked on in mute horror. A few people took out their phones and started filming. Amara didn't know what to do. Her whole body burned with humiliation, but something else was growing inside, a quiet resistance she couldn't yet explain. "I'm not going to remove the booth, sir," she said firmly, lifting her chin. Gerard hadn't expected that. His eyes narrowed. "Oh, yeah? So you chose resistance. Well, then I'll teach you respect for the law." He took a step closer, his hand reaching for the handcuffs. The crowd gasped. In that moment, Amara's fear was replaced by determination. She knew the world didn't have to be like this, but how to prove it when even the smallest gesture against injustice could lead to disaster? Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you or your loved ones had something similar in your life? Share your impressions. We want to know what you think. If you like such exciting stories, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. And now we continue. "Don't you understand how laws work, girl?" Gerard asked sharply, looking down at Amara. His cold gaze seemed to burn through her. "Do you have a license to trade?" "Permission?" Amara asked, trying to catch her breath. She could feel her voice shaking, but she kept talking. "It's just lemonade." "Just lemonade?" Gerard interrupted, stretching his words mockingly. "You know how many times I've heard that from people like you? First it's just lemonade, then it's just a stolen bike, and then it's robbery or worse." Amara took a step back, stunned. "I didn't steal anything. I just want to make some money," she said, trying not to look him in the eye. Gerard smirked, noticing her confusion. "Ah, so you're an entrepreneur now?" He squinted. "Where are your papers? Where's your trading license? Or did you think you could just come in here, set up this junk, and do whatever you wanted?" "I didn't know I needed permission, sir," Amara admitted, her voice becoming almost a whisper. "Didn't know doesn't absolve you of responsibility, girl." His voice grew louder. "You think there are no laws for people like you?" The crowd gathered around him froze. People began to whisper, but no one dared to intervene. The phones kept shooting, but that only made Gerard more annoyed. "Can I at least call my mom?" Amara asked timidly. "Mom?" He laughed, but his laugh was rough and angry. "Sure, call Mommy. Maybe she too can explain why her daughter thinks she can break the rules." Amara felt a chill run down her back. "It's not a violation, sir," she said quietly, gathering the remnants of her courage. "I'm just selling lemonade." Gerard leaned sharply toward her, his face dangerously close. "Just selling?" he hissed. "Or do you just think you can do whatever you want because no one will stop you?" She clenched her fists, feeling tears begin to run down her cheeks, but she wouldn't let herself cry. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. Gerard grinned and straightened up. He pulled out a notebook, pretending to write something down. "All right," he said, pulling back the hood of his uniform. "I'm going to write you a report now, and if you decide to object, you'll come with me to the station. You'll sit there until you realize what real consequences are." Amara wanted to say something, but her voice was stuck in her throat. Her eyes darted around the crowd for support, but people averted their eyes, afraid to intervene. "So, are you ready to clean up this mess, or do you want me to keep going?" Gerard stood over her like a predator over its prey. "It's not a mess," she said at last, her voice shaking again, but there was something like protest in it. "This is my booth, and I have a right to stand here." "Right?" he shouted. "You don't have any rights until I tell you you have them. Remember that, girl." Those words hung in the air like a blow. The crowd gasped, but still no one dared to intervene. Amara stood with her fists clenched, her face burning with humiliation. But somewhere deep inside, there was a spark of anger. She couldn't believe that her simple dream of selling lemonade could lead to such a humiliating moment. Gerard looked at her again, grinned contemptuously, and started typing something into his phone. "Wait here. We're about to test your honesty." He took a couple of steps away to talk on the radio, but Amara knew this wasn't over. Her dream of a school trip was gone, and in its place was fear. But along with the fear grew something else, an unrelenting desire to prove that she deserved better. The sun was still shining, but for Amara the day had turned gloomy. Gerard stood across from her, arms crossed over his chest, his dark glasses reflecting her frightened face. People gathered around as if an invisible magnet was drawing them to the scene. "I already told you, sir." Amara's voice was weak, but she tried to remain firm. "It's just lemonade. I just wanted to make some money." "It's just lemonade," Gerard repeated with a sneer. "Are you sure there isn't something in your lemonade that's forbidden?" "Forbidden." These words caused a surprised murmur in the crowd. Someone gasped. Someone whispered. Amara felt her face heat up, not from the sun, but from shame and anger. "What do you mean?" she asked, swallowing hard. "You know what I mean, girl." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her booth. "I've seen your kind, the ones who pretend to be innocent, but are really playing a double game." "It's a lie," she blurted out, tears welling up in her eyes. Gerard smiled at this reaction, his voice even harsher. "False? Then prove it. Do you have a license? Do you have papers? No? Then you're breaking the law." He held up his hand to stop her as she tried to speak. "Don't interrupt. You're supposed to listen when a lawman is talking to you right now." The crowd began to murmur. Some were clearly on Amara's side. "It's just a girl. She's not doing anything wrong," said someone from the crowd. "Leave her alone. It's only lemonade," shouted the old woman. But Gerard wasn't paying attention. His face was like he'd been chiseled from stone. He didn't tolerate anyone trying to question his authority. "This is how it starts," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "First the innocent lemonade, then they start thinking they can get around any law." The word "they" sounded especially loud, as if a hammer had struck an anvil. Amara froze. She knew what he meant. Everyone knew. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said loudly, gathering all her courage. "Oh, you're still arguing?" Gerard stepped closer to her. His voice became a whisper, but loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Are you sure you want to go down this path? I can make your life a lot more complicated than you can imagine." Those words were like a blow to the chest. Amara felt her hands start to shake, but at the same moment she noticed that people around her were taking pictures on their phones. "Let everyone see," she said in a suddenly firm voice. "Let everyone know how you treat kids who just want to sell lemonade." The crowd applauded. Gerard froze. A shadow of anger flickered across his face, and he turned sharply back to the people. "Disperse, or I'll have you all arrested for interfering with the police," he shouted. But that only increased the tension. The men didn't move. Gerard turned to Amara again. "You made a huge mistake, girl," he said threateningly. "You had a chance to end this peacefully, but you blew it." He pulled out the handcuffs. The crowd roared even louder. "Are you seriously going to arrest a child?" shouted a man from the crowd. Gerard ignored him. He slowly leaned toward Amara. "Next time, think before you defy the law," he hissed in her face. He had already reached out to grab her when someone's loud voice pierced the noise. "Get your hands off my daughter." The crowd turned around. A tall man in an austere suit was hurrying toward the booth. His face was determined and his eyes burned with anger. It was her father, Daniel Wilkes. "I said, get your hands off my daughter," Daniel Wilkes repeated loudly, breaking through the crowd, but Gerard had already made up his mind. "Step back, mister," Gerard said calmly but threateningly, keeping his gaze on Amara. "It's police procedure." Amara felt the cold metal handcuffs slam into her wrists with a crunch. Her small hands looked even thinner and more helpless in the bulky steel shackles. "What are you doing?" she shouted, struggling to stay on her feet as he yanked her arm. "I'm arresting you for illegal activity and resisting a police officer," Gerard said dryly. "But I didn't do anything wrong," Amara screamed, her voice shaking with fear. "People like you never admit it," he muttered, leaning over to cuff her tighter. "You think you can act the way you want, just because everyone else feels sorry for you?" The crowd froze, their outrage growing by the minute. "It's a baby," shouted the woman. "You have no right," shouted a man in a t-shirt, filming everything on his phone. But Gerard only smirked. He relished his power, knowing that the crowd would do nothing. "I have a right. I am the law, and I decide who breaks it," he said, glancing around the crowd. He turned again to Amara, who was now crying. "Do you hear them?" he hissed in her face. "These people protect you because you're weak. They think you're harmless. But I know the truth. You're one of those people who live by your own rules, thinking the system won't do anything to you. Well, I'll teach you." His words hit like slaps. Amara stood with her head down, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. "You're nothing more than a little fraud," Gerard continued, his voice so loud that the whole crowd could hear him. "You thought you could use your innocence as a shield." "This is overkill," shouted someone from the crowd. "You are a grown man, and this is a child." Another woman was indignant, but Gerard was adamant. "Everybody back," he shouted, pulling his baton from his belt, "or I'll start issuing fines to each of you for obstruction of justice." At that moment, Amara looked up. She looked at the crowd, at the people who wanted to help her but were afraid, and felt something inside her break. She was scared, humiliated, but not broken. "I didn't do anything," she said, looking directly at Gerard. "You sure did," he barked, yanking at her cuffs. "You've become a problem, and I know how to deal with people like you." "This is your last chance to stop, officer," came the sudden voice of Daniel Wilkes, who was now standing directly in front of him. Gerard turned around, his gaze narrowing. "Who are you to threaten me?" "I'm the district attorney," Daniel said, his voice hard and threatening. "And you just made the biggest mistake of your career." The crowd froze. Even Gerard lost his composure for a moment. But when he recovered quickly, he grinned derisively. "Prosecutor? Good. Then you know your daughter broke the law." "Do you know you've overstepped your authority?" Daniel retorted, his eyes glistening with rage. "You humiliated a child in front of all these people, violated her rights and assaulted her. And I will personally hold you accountable for that." Gerard felt the crowd begin to move closer to him. His confidence shook, but he still tried to keep his face. "We'll see how you prove it," he said, though his voice was no longer as strong as before. Daniel stepped closer to his daughter, his gaze resting on her crying face. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," he said, touching her shoulder. But Amara knew. This was far from over. There were long days of fighting ahead of them, and she wasn't about to give up. The video, shot by one of the neighbors, had already gone viral on messengers. The screen showed a uniformed police officer twisting the hands of a young black girl and handcuffing her. The sound of comments, shouts from the crowd, and the officer's demeaning words accompanied the footage, which made the blood run cold. "It's her. It's Amara." Daniel Wilkes froze in place, holding the phone in his hands. His heart clenched at what he saw. His daughter, his pride, his little girl, was kneeling on the sidewalk surrounded by people, but completely alone in front of the system that was supposed to protect her. He didn't even finish watching the video. He already had one thought in his head: "I have to be there, now." Daniel grabbed the keys and rushed to the car. His fingers trembled as he started the engine, but his resolve was firm. Outside at the lemonade stand, the tension continued to build. Gerard stood, arms folded smugly across his chest, watching Amara sit on the pavement, crying and humiliated. The crowd was getting more and more rowdy. Phones were still filming, but no one dared to come any closer. "I'd get out of here if I were you," Gerard threw toward the man who was filming the scene. "This is a police matter, not your petty problem." "You're the problem," the man replied quietly but firmly. "People need to see how you treat children." Gerard grimaced but said nothing. He knew his powers gave him an advantage for now. The roar of an engine tore through the air. The crowd parted as a car arrived on the scene. The door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a dark suit who moved with cold confidence. "Daniel Wilkes," someone in the crowd said. "It's her father," the woman whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Gerard noticed Daniel immediately. His smug smile disappeared, but he quickly regained his indifference. "So, you must be the father," he said lazily. "It's good that you're here. Perhaps you can help your daughter understand that laws are not to be broken." "Laws?" Daniel stepped closer, his face stony, his voice icy. "You call that law enforcement? I call it abuse of power." "Your opinion doesn't matter," Gerard said, though his voice sounded less confident now. "She was selling without a license, and that's against the law." "Without a license?" Daniel snorted, his eyes narrowing. "This is a kid who sells lemonade, and you dare humiliate her in front of all these people? Do you consider that decent behavior for a police officer?" Gerard took a step forward, but the crowd around him froze, scrutinizing every movement. "I'm just doing my job," he said, trying to sound firm. "If your daughter doesn't understand the rules, that's not my problem." "No, that's your problem," Daniel said sharply, his voice louder than the noise of the crowd. "Because you just violated my child's rights. You used force against a minor for no reason. You insulted and humiliated her. And you think that's going to go unchallenged?" Gerard fell silent. Daniel's gaze, full of anger and determination, made him feel insecure. "Release her." "Now," Daniel demanded. "I don't have to take orders from you," Gerard replied coldly, though his tone was less confident. "Oh, you have to." Daniel pulled out his phone and held it up. "Because all of this is already documented. These people saw everything. And that video's going to end up in court, and then it's going to end up on the news channels. You want your career shut down by a kid with a lemonade stand?" The crowd became animated. People started nodding and talking approvingly. "Take off the cuffs," Daniel repeated, stepping closer. Gerard glanced at the people around him, then at the cameras. He realized that the situation was out of control. With a disgruntled expression on his face, he pulled out a key and uncuffed Amara with a loud click. Daniel immediately leaned over to his daughter, helping her up. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer, but his eyes still burning with anger. "You're safe." Amara clung to her father, but there was still fear in her eyes. "This isn't over," Gerard threw in, trying to maintain the remnants of his power. "You're right," Daniel replied, turning toward him. "This is just the beginning." The crowd erupted in applause, and Gerard, unable to bear the stares of the people, slowly backed away to his car. But Daniel knew that the fight had only just begun. This was a day he would never forget, and neither would the system he was now about to challenge. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you or your loved ones had something similar in your life? Share your thoughts. We value your opinion. If you enjoy such compelling stories, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. The crowd did not disperse. People whispered, looked at their phones, kept filming. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Amara stood next to her father, her hands still trembling slightly after the handcuffs had been removed. She felt protected, but the anger in Daniel's eyes made it clear. This conflict wasn't over. Gerard, arms crossed, stood across from them, trying to maintain his arrogance. "So, Prosecutor Wilkes," he began, deliberately emphasizing the word prosecutor with a note of sarcasm. "You can put on a little show here, but the fact remains that your daughter broke the law." Daniel took a step forward, keeping his gaze on him. His voice was as cold as ice, each word as sharp as a blade. "My daughter broke the law?" He paused, giving Gerard a chance to feel the weight of his words. "Let me get this straight, officer. You're talking about a kid who was selling lemonade. Is that the kind of violation you've decided is worthy of the use of force? Trafficking without a permit is still a violation." Gerard stood his ground, trying to speak firmly, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Are you serious?" Daniel tilted his head as if studying his opponent's behavior. "You, a police officer, decided that the best way to respond to a situation was to twist the arms of a 12-year-old? The crowd began to whisper louder. People exchanged indignant glances. "I'm following protocol," Gerard parried, straightening his back. "The law is the law." "Protocol?" Daniel stepped even closer, his tone threatening. "Show me the protocol. Point out the paragraph that says you have the right to use physical force against a kid who sells lemonade." Gerard faltered, but quickly returned to his arrogant look. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said. "I'm here to keep order. If someone breaks the law, it's my job to act." "No," Daniel said, his voice loud and clear, silencing the crowd. "Your job is to protect people, not abuse your power. You just violated several articles: abuse of authority, violation of a minor's rights, and possibly prejudice based on racial stereotypes." Gerard frowned, but tried to wave it away. "You're making a big deal out of it," he said, but without the same confidence. "Really?" Daniel pulled out his phone, scrolling through the tapes that were already starting to come to him from witnesses. "Because I have videos of you twisting my daughter's arms, saying derogatory things and threatening the crowd. Are you sure you want to continue?" Gerard tried to regain his credibility. "Videos don't prove anything. You know how it happens. People take pictures, cut out the context, and then we, the police, get blamed. Context? Daniel grinned, but there was cold fury in his gaze. The context here is clear. You used your uniform and badge to humiliate a child. You deliberately misrepresented the situation to justify your actions. The crowd began to applaud. Cheers of approval erupted from all sides. Do you think this is an act? Gerard raised his hand, pointing at the people. These people don't understand how the law works. And you? Daniel answered instantly. Because I see before me a man who has no respect for the law or his position, and I'm sure this video will quickly remind everyone what you're capable of. Gerard clenched his fists. His gaze darted between Daniel and the crowd. He knew he was losing. Do you think this is the end? He hissed. You won't get anywhere. The system is on my side. The system? Daniel paused, looking him straight in the eye. Believe me, I know the system better than you do. I know how it works, and I know how to make it work against those who think that uniforms give them the right to oppress others. Gerard fell silent. He realized that further arguments would only make things worse for him. You'll regret this, he said, turning sharply and heading for his car. You're the one who'll regret it, Daniel said into his back. As the police car drove away, the crowd erupted in applause and shouts of encouragement. Daniel turned to Amara, his gaze softening. Are you okay? He asked, hugging his daughter. Amara nodded, but her eyes were full of tears. I'm proud of you, honey, he said. But this isn't over. We will fight, and the truth will prevail. This time, his words sounded like a promise, and it was a promise he was going to keep. It all started with the morning news. Video of Amara's arrest went viral on social media, with headlines screaming, "Child arrested for selling lemonade," and "Small-town scandal with racist overtones." The reports were accompanied by footage of Gerard twisting the arms of a crying girl. People watched with bewilderment and outrage, but the police reacted quickly. A police department spokesman issued a statement the same day. Officer Gerard Slocum acted within the bounds of protocol. His actions are for the purpose of law and order. These words caused a wave of outrage, but within the system itself, another, quieter storm began. Daniel Wilkes sat at his desk, immersed in papers. His office was cluttered with paperwork, complaints, pleadings, and statements of law. Next to him was a folder labeled Case Against Officer Gerard Slocum. They're trying to cover for him, he said, looking at his lawyer and old friend Marcus Ridge. Of course they do, Marcus answered, leaning on the edge of the table. It's not the first time. He'd had complaints before, misuse of force, racist remarks, but they'd all been hushed up. The system protects its own, Dan. It's not going to be easy. I know, Daniel said, leaning back in his chair, but I'm not backing down. He humiliated my daughter, and he has to answer for it. Marcus nodded, but his gaze remained serious. We'll start by filing a lawsuit for wrongful arrest and civil rights violations, he said. But be prepared. They will use anything to discredit Amara. Daniel clenched his fists. Let them try, he said quietly, anger in his voice. A week after the incident, formal proceedings began. Police representatives presented their arguments. Officer Slocum was acting within the law, said the police attorney. Trafficking is a crime, no matter how minor it may seem. The officer also feared that illegal substances could have been sold under the guise of lemonade. In a boardroom full of reporters, Daniel jumped up. Worried? His voice cut through the tense silence. It's a child. A 12-year-old girl selling lemonade on a quiet street. Are you seriously trying to make us believe she was a threat? Citizen Wilkes, please keep order, interrupted the judge, but Daniel didn't back down. This is not an order. It's an attempt to justify blatant racism, he continued, addressing the audience. If my daughter had been a child of color, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. These words caused a murmur. The police representatives looked tense, but did not lose their composure. We will present evidence that the officer was acting under instructions, the police attorney continued, pretending to ignore the accusations of racism. We will also present records showing that Mr. Wilkes is trying to use his position to smear the officer. Daniel felt his anger building. Outside the court, a new battle began for public opinion. The press was divided. Some supported Daniel, while others sided with the police. Experts were invited to talk shows to argue whether Gerard's action was justified. A debate has been brewing on social media. This is racism in its purest form. This policeman should be held accountable for his actions, some wrote. The girl should have known the law. There are rules for everyone. Others objected. But that didn't matter to Daniel. He realized that this case had become more than just a conflict between him and Gerard. Now it was a fight for Amara and for everyone who faced injustice. At the second hearing, the police presented a new argument. We have witnesses who state that Mr. Wilkes was acting aggressively toward the officer, the lawyer said, smiling. Daniel wasn't even surprised. Of course you found witnesses, he said quietly to Marcus as he sat down at the table. We have witnesses too, Dan, Marcus replied, and they're real. When an elderly woman from that very crowd came to the podium, she looked directly at the judge. I saw it all with my own eyes, she began. That girl was just selling lemonade, and that officer, he said terrible things. He called her one of those, said that people like her were always breaking the rules. It was disgusting. Her words caused a shock. There was a commotion in the hall. The judge banged his gavel several times to bring back the silence. Daniel knew. This was only one battle. The road to justice would be long, but he was ready to go all the way. The system had cracked, and now he was going to destroy it. It was a week after the second hearing, but life would never be the same for Amara and her family. The house that had always been quiet and safe now seemed like a besieged fortress. The morning began with dozens of notifications on their phones, articles, videos, comments. Amara scrolled through them with trembling hands, and each message seemed to hide a threat or a taunt. They're always trying to make themselves look like victims. The system works, and you're just looking for a way to evade the law. Little liar, you should stay home instead of breaking the rules. She tried not to read, but it was impossible. She had phrases stuck in her head that she saw over and over again. They sounded like accusations, and with each passing day her confidence faded. Amara sat in her room, closing her laptop with another video discussing her case. She saw her face on the screen, crying, humiliated. She felt like that image would stay with her forever. "Honey," came her mother's voice from outside the door. "Dinner's ready." "I'm not hungry," Amara replied, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. The door opened and her mom came in, sat down next to her and hugged her. "You're strong, Amara," she said. "People will always say mean things because it's easier for them to judge than to try to understand." "But why did it happen to me?" Amara whispered. "I just wanted to sell lemonade." "Because you're too bright to go unnoticed," Mother said, "and that scares people who don't understand what it's like to be you." Amara felt warm at those words, but they couldn't drown out the voices of the haters in her head. Meanwhile, the pressure on Daniel was growing on the other side. The court corridors, where he had always felt confident, were now filled with whispers. Colleagues with whom he used to have lunch now looked away. At one meeting, the supervisor, Mr. Graves, called him into his office. "Daniel, I appreciate your work," Graves began, sitting behind the massive desk. "You're one of the best prosecutors out there, and you have a brilliant career." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied, sensing a "but" would follow. "But this situation with your daughter, it's gotten too much attention. We've been getting complaints. People think you're using your position for personal gain." "Personal gain?" Daniel raised his eyebrows, his voice becoming harsh. "My daughter was humiliated and arrested for no reason. This case isn't about profit, it's about justice." Graves sighed, interlocking his fingers on the table. "I understand that you're protecting your family, but this case is getting out of hand. If you keep pushing the police, it could end badly, not just for you, but for all of us." "Are you suggesting I surrender?" Daniel asked, leaning forward. "I suggest you think about your career," Graves said softly. "You know how it works, don't you? People forget about scandals if you leave them alone." Daniel stood up, his eyes burning with anger. "If this happened to your child, would you also say, 'Leave it alone'?" Graves answered nothing, but his silence was eloquent enough. The next day, when Daniel returned home, he noticed a group of reporters gathered in front of the house. The cameras aimed at him as soon as he got out of the car. "Minus Mr. Wilkes. Are you continuing with the court case?" shouted one of the journalists. "How would you comment on the police claims that your daughter broke the law?" added another. "Do you believe the charges against Officer Slocum are fair?" "No comment," Daniel tossed, trying to make his way to the door. Inside the house, he was met by his wife with a concerned face. "It's unbearable," she said, looking out the window at the crowd of journalists. "We can't live in peace anymore." "I know," Daniel replied, taking off his jacket. "But if I stop now, they win. And they're not the only ones. Everyone who uses their power against those who can't defend themselves will feel they can do it with impunity." "What about Amara?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at his daughter, who sat at the table with her head down. "She's strong," he said, though you could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Late in the afternoon, when the house finally fell into silence, Amara walked into the kitchen where her father sat surrounded by papers. "Daddy," she said quietly. Daniel looked up. "Yes, sweetie? Are we going to win?" Her voice shook, but there was something new in her eyes. Determination. He smiled and stood up, wrapping his arms around her. "Yes," he said. "We're going to win." He put everything he could into those words, because it wasn't just their family at stake, it was the truth. And the truth, he knew, was always worth fighting for. The courtroom was overcrowded. Every corner was filled with journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens of the city. For them, the case was more than just a dispute between the Wilkes family and the police department. It became a symbol of a struggle against a system that has turned a blind eye to injustice for too long. Amara sat next to her father at the long table. She wore an austere gray jacket that seemed to make her look older, but her face showed tension. She fidgeted with the corner of a file folder, trying not to meet the eyes of the people in the room. Gerard Slocum sat on the other side of the table with a cold expression on his face. His lawyer was whispering something in his ear, but he didn't take his eyes off Daniel, as if trying to intimidate him with his gaze. "All rise," Court is in session." The bailiff's voice sounded, and the judge entered the hall. "The final battle has begun. Minus Mr. Wilkes," the judge said, turning to Daniel. "Do you have any evidence you wish to present to the court?" Daniel stood up, his figure imposing. He looked like a man ready to defend the truth to the last man. "Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly. "I would like to introduce the videotapes, witness statements, and documents that prove Officer Slocum's misconduct." The judge nodded. "Go on." The first video was presented. The image appeared on the screen. Gerard roughly twisting Amara's arms, humiliating her in front of the crowd, uttering phrases full of contempt. There were indignant gasps in the audience, and someone in the back rows whispered, "How is that even acceptable?" "That's just part of the context." Gerard's attorney stood up, interrupting the video. The officer was acting within protocol to prevent a possible violation of the law. Daniel smiled. "Your Honor, let's look further," he said, pointing to the screen. The video continued. Now everyone could see Gerard threatening the crowd, pulling out a baton and saying, "People like her never have respect for the law." These words caused an explosion of indignation in the hall. The judge banged his gavel several times to restore silence. "I request that those words be added to the record," Daniel said, looking directly at Gerard. "This is a clear example of racial bias." Gerard looked away, his self-confidence beginning to fade. Next came the testimony of witnesses. An elderly woman who was at the scene that day took the stand. "I saw everything with my own eyes," she said firmly. "That girl was just selling lemonade, and the officer acted like a tyrant. He threatened her, twisted her arms. It was horrible." "Are you sure he was threatening?" Gerard's lawyer tried to object. "I'm sure," she replied, "because I heard what he said. He called her one of those people who always skirt the law. It wasn't just a threat, it was racist. When Gerard took the floor, he tried to defend himself. "I acted according to the law," he said. "I had no intention of humiliating anyone. I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Daniel rejoined. "Let's get to the bottom of what protocol we're talking about. You used force against a child, you twisted her arms, you threatened the crowd. Where in the protocol does it say that's acceptable?" Gerard fell silent. "You have nothing to say because there is no such protocol," Daniel continued. "It was your personal initiative, based on your preconceived beliefs." After hours of questioning, arguments, and counter-arguments, the moment of truth had arrived. The judge looked up from his notes. "I have considered all of the evidence presented and heard all of the testimony," he began. "And I have concluded that Officer Slocum's actions were an abuse of authority. His words and actions confirm the existence of bias." Applause erupted in the hall. Gerard sat with clenched teeth, his face grim. "Officer Slocum," the judge continued, "I recommend that the police department conduct a disciplinary proceeding regarding your conduct. Your license is suspended." For Amara and her family, this was more than just a victory. It was proof that systems can change. When the trial was over, Amara hugged her father. "You did it, Daddy," she whispered. "No, honey," he replied, looking at the crowd of people gathered outside. "We did it together. This story was no longer just theirs. It became a symbol of hope for everyone who had ever faced injustice." Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you or a loved one experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your opinions and stories are very important to us. We sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. If you like this story, Please support us by subscribing to the channel and giving us a like. We wish you a good day and justice in every step you take.